Hi, everyone. It's Terry Bruce, and this is another 10-minute nonprofit evaluation tips. Now, this month, we're talking about outputs versus outcomes versus impact. And within the evaluation ecosystem, this falls within the evaluation schema bubble or domain, where we're talking about what are you measuring and how are you going to measure it, and what type of questions are you asking. Now, we've talked in depth about outputs versus outcomes, and you hopefully, maybe, possibly have had sort of a eye-opening experience now where you realize that you have been talking about the results of your work only in terms of outputs, and in fact, possibly not terribly effective outputs or unrelated outputs. And usually right about now, what happens is organizations start to have a panic attack. And often what I find is now they need to formulate some outcomes, or they realize they need to track other outputs, that the outputs they're tracking are not terribly effective. And they just need to get some other data to look at. And usually what happens is they then try to go and pull in all the information that they can, and they just start grabbing random stuff, hoping that it reveals something to them. And I want to talk about that this week, because this is usually a pretty critical stage of development for organizations getting into evaluation, is when they start to realize they now know what they don't know, which is a whole lot, and that there's gaps in their knowledge, and they have a little bit of learning, which makes them dangerous. And they want to just start grabbing data and analyzing it. And oftentimes they want to jump from outputs straight to outcomes now, because they're like, oh, outputs are junk and they don't tell us anything useful. We're going to do outcomes. And you may not have a well-formulated strategic plan. And so you don't really have a lot of guidance on what those outcomes are. A lot of times organizations will say to me, I want you to help me write a report, Terry. And I say, okay, what's the report supposed to do? Well, I want to pull all my data and then analyze it to see if it tells me anything. And the answer is no, boo, no, you don't. That's not how that works. Data is not a magic 8-ball that you shake and say, please tell me something. Oftentimes, additionally, when organizations start getting into evaluation, they have outputs and outcomes that they've identified that are good metrics, that are useful metrics. They start analyzing the data, and the data doesn't tell them anything they don't know already. We're wonderful, and our programs are performing perfectly. And they feel disappointed. They're like, we already knew that. We went through all this trouble to come up with outcomes, to get a database or a data management system, to develop reports. We're pulling the reports. We're doing your bubbles, Terry. We're going around the evaluation ecosystem model. We're analyzing the data in a timely fashion. We're reporting and distributing it. We have feedback loops, and it's not telling us anything we didn't already know. Something must be wrong. We're looking at the wrong data, and we need to immediately start pulling in more data, because there's got to be a problem here that the data will reveal for us to focus on and solve. Or organizations know something is wrong. Maybe they just a feeling that something could be better, something's off, maybe there's a morale issue, but they're just hoping that the data is going to point to, like a magic bullet, what that issue is. And when that doesn't happen, people freak out and then just start grabbing all the data. That's not really how evaluation works. Okay, that was a softball. That's not how evaluation works at all. It's not just data mining where we pull all the data in and just randomly look at things, trying to figure out what's going on. Now, the first is, this is a cartoon by a cartoonist named Jessica Hagee that perfectly illustrates the first pitfall of this approach of just grab all the data and just start doing random analysis, hoping that you discover something. Here we have on our x-axis the amount of information you can have versus on the y-axis the amount of confusion you can have. And as information is low, confusion is high. As we gather more information, suddenly clarity and illumination happen and confusion goes down. But after a certain point, there are diminishing returns. And the more information we get, the more confusion we get. So there is a balancing point between the amount of information you're looking at and the amount of confusion you'll have. And certainly, if you've ever tried to look at like a dashboard report that has 50 metrics on it, it becomes very overwhelming and it's very hard to tell what's going on. or if we too finely slice the onion. So if you get down into the weeds too far, and you kind of are looking at discrete patterns, right? Let's say you had 10 people participate in a program and 30% of them dropped out. So 3 of them dropped out of the program. And you're like, oh gosh, 30% dropout rate, that seems really high. So then you start looking at the 3 individual people, trying to figure out why did they drop out. And when you realize that each had different reasons for dropping out and there were different problems, you realize there's sort of no pattern there. It's just the sample size was extremely small, which probably affected, if you only had 3 people out of 100 people drop out, you'd realize there was no problem. You wouldn't have even been diving into that data. So when you have a very small sample size, and then you try to get into the discrete sort of variables and instances trying to detect a pattern when there isn't one, again, confusion happens. Well, we can't draw any conclusions because it was only 3 people and they all had very different reasons for dropping out. I guess our conclusion is everything is fine. But at the same time, we now just had a really unsuccessful program where we had a 30% dropout rate, and our grant funder is not happy about that. And we really hoped the data would show something that would allow us to answer that. So people say, well, what is the solution then, Terry? Like, how are we supposed to figure out what metrics to look at when the ones we're looking at aren't telling us anything? Or how do we know if we're doing effective analysis? Maybe we're doing the wrong type of analysis on, we're looking at averages and we should be looking at standard deviations or something like that. And what I always tell people is it goes back to fundamentals, which is the scientific method. Evaluation is a science, and it's a science for a reason. It's social science, but it's still science. And if you think way back to grade school, middle school, maybe junior high at the latest, but you learned the scientific method at some point. And the scientific method says that you start with a research question. You start with a specific thing you want to know. Then you formulate a hypothesis. You develop testable predictions. So that's how do you test your hypothesis? You test and you gather some data, and then you look at that data and see what the data tells you. And then you may have to refine your hypothesis and repeat forever, ever, and ever. That is evaluation in a nutshell. That's the same thing that you're doing right now with evaluation, is you need to start with a research question, not show me all my data and I'm going to slice and dice it in 100 different ways to see if it'll tell me something. Start with a specific question. What is the intended impact of my program, and is my program having that impact? What is the intended result of people taking this class, and are people having that result? We had low enrollment for this program. I think it was because the time we held the class. Let's find out if that's what happened. Or nope, it wasn't the time we held. Everybody said that wasn't the barrier, but in looking at that, we gathered other data that gave us some indicators that maybe it was the location. Turns out there was no public transportation, and we didn't realize that our community, the people who would be taking this program, didn't have transportation, or maybe there's a 2-hour parking limit outside, or 30-minute meters for a 2-hour workshop, and people were unable to attend because we didn't have adequate parking on site, something like that. So that's what you want to do, is you want to start with a question all the time. Now, people go, but Terry, that's super tedious. Now I have to write 50 reports because I have 50 different questions. And the answer to that is, yes, you do, boo. Yes, you do. Evaluation is not necessarily easy. There's no shortcuts and there's no quick fixes. But generally what I tell people is also, if you start with a question, is my program performing as expected? Is it serving the number of people we want to serve, or that we have the capacity to serve? And you look at that for a few months and the answer is yes. If nothing changes, you don't have to keep looking at that data. Stop pulling that data every single month because nothing has changed. If you're still, the need hasn't changed in the community, you're still delivering the program in the same way, you're still getting the same results, you'll know if you're getting 100 people a month, then that's not a metric that needs to go on your dashboard. Replace it with something else. Come up with a new question. Once you figure out something is working fine, you only have to check it every once in a while, just make sure nothing's going off the rails. But generally, your program manager is probably going to know. They're going to go, well, Mama, we usually get 100 people registered for this program and we had 20 this month. And then the next month you have 20. You've got a problem. You need to pull a research question. Why has enrollment dropped significantly? And look at it. But otherwise, if everything is continuing, love, entropy, right? A body in motion stays in motion until acted upon by another entity or body. If nothing is changing, move on to a new research question. Evaluation is ongoing, it's eternal, and it's iterative. It is not one thing that you do once or one thing you do and then keep doing the same exact thing over and over. You are going to constantly be maturing, growing, and evolving, where your research questions are going to change, what you're looking at, and the sophistication of the way that you're measuring those results is going to change and grow, hopefully, if you are doing evaluation correctly. So do not think, I'm just going to gather all the data and slice and dice it until I find something. That is really difficult way to approach evaluation, and almost never are you actually going to be able to find anything of use, because there's so much data you could look at, and you could look at in so many different ways that it's just searching for a needle in a haystack. Start with a specific question and then get the data that supports answering that particular question. That is going to be a much more effective way to do evaluation. All right, well, that is it for this week. Join me next week. We've got one more discussion topic about outputs versus outcomes versus impact. In the meantime, like, subscribe, and share the Substack blog, and feel free to join the conversation and ask any questions or provide any feedback at terrybruce.substack.com.